Yeah, so the title Continuations comes from the idea that everything is a continuation. There's nothing that's static within the Buddhist idea of what the universe is and the Taoist idea of what the universe is, which is comes from I guess Eastern thoughts and philosophies. So within this exhibition, there's many aspects that are continuing. So for one thing, these panel paintings, which are reliefs, are a continuation of my art practice from my MFA program. So these were actually originally made in 2020 and then put into storage, but before they were put into storage, I had to destroy all the reliefs for them to fit in the storage. So they are being remade, but this exhibition is a continuation of that exploration and idea. So another aspect of continuation is that the figure of the Arhat, which is sort of what these figures are, molded from, they're actually part of the Buddhist lexicon of sort of ascended figures. They're not quite Buddhas, and they're not quite lay people. So they've reached a certain amount of attainment, but they're still capable of regression, still capable of illusions and delusions. So within sort of a spiritual continuum, that's also the continuity of spirituality as well in these pieces. And also I'm continuing a sort of artistic tradition of depicting arhats, which are spiritual and religious iconography. And within this tradition, artists in East Asia were able to be more free and experimental because these forms, these arhat forms, they allow for more interpretation. So people were able to experiment freely and also developing new techniques to enter sort of artistic canons of East Asian art. Yeah, so it's interesting you brought up ascending and ascetic and aesthetics. So I think they are interrelated in this body of work. So within Buddhism, first and foremost is more of a healing practice, actually. So that, in the first sort of priority of Buddhism, right, is how do you heal from something? Within the dictum, somebody shot by an arrow. You don't ask them whether God exists or not. You ask them how can I help you from your suffering? First remove the arrow and then patch up the wound, right? So that to me is a way of relating to this sort of spiritual practice that's about healing. And then also the other aspect is the recognition or the recognition that there is suffering, right? So in the fourfold path, number one is recognize that there's suffering. So in that aspect, that's compassion, right? So how do we see each other in our humanness? So to me, these practices are spiritual practices, and this idea of ascending is a way to sort of structure this spiritual practice in what we call religion today. That wasn't really always the case. What I'm fascinated about Buddhist iconography is that there's a whole lineage of this sort of belief system that when it first came about, there's actually no iconography. So some of the earliest Buddhist structures was just a stupa, and some of the earliest storytelling was depictions of all of Buddha's teaching, and within the center is actually just emptiness. There's no figuration. It took thousands of years before this sort of central figure emerged. Part of this exhibition is also questioning this central iconography, questioning how these belief systems move through time and space, questioning how sort of spiritual spaces communicate these ideas, right? So I'm using the mode of relief painting, which is something that you'll see in a lot of as well. And then in terms of just conflating these ideas of asceticism, which means to sort of be, I guess, by yourself in your spiritual practice, it feels sort of like having a studio practice, actually. So I can relate to that, like being able to get down to the core of yourself, being able to get down to the core of understanding how one relates to materiality, both the materiality of a painting, but also the materiality of your own body, how it's tied to the spirit as well, and how the materiality of the world we live in is tied to the spirit as well, and how all these things aren't separate. When you go to a temple, for example, the Lingying Temple in Hangzhou, China, you feel elated, or you feel that you're steeped into thousands of years of history and craft and art. And then you go to like maybe the World Trade Center, right? And you feel that there is this blueprint or this architecture that's more about state power, capital power. So like architecture inherently implicates an ideology, and these ideologies inherently implicate or is pressed into the body of the person who walks into it. So I'm really curious about how these ideas travel out of books, out of blueprints, out of architecture, and is imprinted in the body. And then I'm also curious about how the body carries these ideas and propagates these ideas elsewhere. For example, when I was doing my MFA, I was very much steeped in sort of the philosophies and belief systems and the art of Southeast Asian culture. Some of it was Buddhism, some of it was Taoism, some of it was Confucianism. There wasn't really all that categorized at a certain time period. And that's also sort of how my family relates to it as well. So my parents have a shrine that has all these aspects, from Confucianism to Taoism to Buddhism. It's all there in one place. And then, a shrine is an architectural piece, So these are the things that I'm thinking about as I'm making the works. And to me, all of this is just a continuation, and we are continuations as we're carrying these things with us. We carry the institutions with us, we carry the language with us, and at the same time we propagate these things. As an immigrant in the United States, I grew up in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, which, as a kid, you don't really have any autonomy. As my brother once said, when you're a kid, you get shuffled around like a watermelon. You don't know where you're going. You don't have so much say as to where your life is headed. But with that being said, my parents, have an innate sense of how to navigate the world as they know it, and that comes from how they were brought up, essentially. So my parents were farmers from Taishan, China, and when we moved to Sunset Park, we had this really lush garden. The house was quite small, but the garden was really amazing and beautiful. It was like Pan's Labyrinth. You walk in there, you're in a different universe, where things are sprouting and growing, and there's like insects and little wildlife and critters there. And to me, the sense of nature and this idea of like death, birth, and decay and planting seeds was very innately sort of just absorbed within me. And that's sort of how I navigate the world as well. And in the same way that my parents aren't necessarily capable of articulating to me what Confucianism or Taoism is, they sort of go with the flow in that sort of embrace of nature as well, and that's sort of how I go through life. And it wasn't until many years since going to grad school that I sort of have a more intuitive sense of what that means to me, and that sort of goes directly into the artworks as well, and in my art practice of how I sort of formulate my art practice in a more process-oriented way. I think of my art studio as a place, like a garden, where I'm like planting seeds, I'm tending to it, I'm watering it, I'm giving it nutrients. And some of them grow into these like big shrubs or larger trees, and some of them never make it, and they get sort of consumed into the soil of my studio and like put into different pieces. So, you know, like that philosophy really took hold, and these seeds, you know, they were planted in me in my childhood very early on, and they take form many years later. But with that being said, you know, my undergrad education was very much different from that. It was more of a Western ideological take of art and art making, which was more sort of a modernist take, a more language take on it. You know, isolating certain aesthetics or certain ways of decision making, and that was a different way of working for me that I would say was formative, but I had to discard a lot of that in order to have a more process-based practice that I feel much more akin to. So when it comes to the materiality of my art pieces, I come at it from many different layers and many different angles. I try not to sort of constrain myself in one way of working when it comes to materials. So number one, going back to the idea of the garden has been really been in this sort of an aesthetic source of inspiration. So, you know, walking into a garden, you sort of feel the sense that everything is overflowing, everything is growing, and everything has a life of its own. You know, if you look at like a square foot of just the soil, you'll find snails, you'll find, you know, maybe caterpillars, maybe you'll find ladybugs and plants. So each thing inhabiting their own life, having their own life story, essentially coexisting and also being interrelated, right? One thing cannot exist without the other. You know, the whole ecosystem exists at once. So I like to think about materials in that way as well, where all the things that I come across have their own life and they have their own trajectory. So for example, the electronics that you've mentioned, you know, perhaps it was a cell phone that broke, it has its own life. But then we look inside the cell phone, there's this circuitry that perhaps its minerals were mined from a different continent, perhaps it was assembled in another separate continent, and perhaps you know, it was sold to me through other agencies. And all these things are coming together and coexisting that is very global, but it comes to me in a very localized experience. And you know, that also has to do with all the inundation of materials. You know, you'll see there's a lot of detritus, you'll see that there's disposable material, you'll also see that there's a lot of natural materials. And I think of, so this goes into the second point of materiality as sort of a way to paint. So the materials, they have their own stories, but they also have their own textures and sheens. So I like to think about using materials as a way to sort of apply paint. You know, like you can apply paint and get a color, but you can also apply material which has an innate color, has an innate texture, has its own sheen. And it also has its own small story, which I love about it. So I like to push this idea of painting to expand into using materials as paint, and also to bring painting into sort of a more globalized, I guess, expression and form. You know, we live in, you know, the show right now is in 2026, right? And, you know, we live in an environment where we're inundated from everything that's global, from the plastics that are made to our electronics, you know, like all the material that comes to us, you know, that we have this experience of touching it, is very much interrelated with the entire globe. And then when we discard them, it affects the entire globe. You know, like it goes into our oceans, it goes into our landfills. Maybe some of it gets recycled and it becomes something else. So, you know, that's also part of the material usage. And then lastly, I think about materials as like a really fun way to create reliefs. So, you know, a lot of my aesthetics is also informed by temple and church reliefs. So to me, when I look at a relief, you know, I feel the art in my body when I enter a church. You know, like, it's not just a viewing experience, it's not just a cerebral experience, but it's, you know, when it's successfully done, all the craft that's going into it, all the artistry that's gone into it, is meant to touch your spirit in some way. And first, in order to do that, it needs to touch the body in some way, right? So for me, reliefs and material sort of does that. You know, you can sort of feel a material by looking at it. We have a shared sense of what a texture might look and feel like. So that's sort of how I come about using all these different types of materials. So my art practice, you know, going back to the idea of gardening, right? There isn't a fixed point. You know, paintings get made, and then they transform into something else. So to me, that's a process. I think as long as I continue to water and tend to the garden, the art will be made. So oftentimes I have many paintings going on at once in my studio, and it's always an exploration. You know, sometimes I have an inkling of an idea of how an art piece is going to look like, but oftentimes I start with like a feeling, or I start with something that's already there in the studio and I recombine it. So it's always a process. And everything is always transforming. You know, going back to the idea of continuations, right? You know, within Buddhism and Taoism, there's this idea that there's no such thing as a fixed, finite item or object or idea or anything really. Things are constantly transforming. It's just a matter of time span, right? You know, the earth is transforming, but in billions and billions of millions and billions of years, right? Versus a cloud, which takes the form of maybe, you know, a sheep or something, and then turning into just a hollow sky, right? So, you know, these are examples within the literature as well of scriptures where things are constantly transforming. So my materials are constantly transforming. The things that I have might look fixed, but they're on a process. You know, the circuits that I have, they get cut up, they get reassembled, they get applied as paint, they get covered up by paint. Like, things are always in the process of becoming. One of the most profound, or some of the most profound art experiences I've ever had was walking into the Lingying Temple in Hangzhou, China, as I've mentioned, and also the Saint Chapelle Temple in Paris, France. So when you walk into these structures, you feel right away in your body, even though you're not able to articulate what's happening, that your body is being influenced by the reliefs, by the iconography, by the colors, by the architecture. You know, for example, in Saint Chapelle, they have these like just beautiful and amazing arch ceilings, so you feel sort of elated, you feel somewhat even transcendent, and this type of art experience or synesthetic experience is very different than, let's say, going to a gallery, right, where the object itself is the object of contemplation, and you're meant to peer through it, at least in the Western sense, in terms of painting, as if you're looking through a window. Hence the, you know, like the first person perspective. So within this exhibition, I wanted to transform this gallery space into sort of like a hybrid space, a liminal space, similar to what the Arhats are, which is liminal figures. And in this liminal space, you know, it's a gallery. It's also a spiritual space. It's also a space for contemplation. It's also a space that holds these sort of like roving Buddhist iconography, right? And there's also audio that's here. So there's all these experiences that I'm hoping will allow the viewer to sort of be seeing what's around them, but also feeling first and foremost within their bodies in relation to the space and in relation to the figure. And when you walk into the space, you'll notice right away that there's 8 paintings, somewhat equally distant, but also each of these paintings have a meditating figure, and this meditating figure is somewhat life-size, so there's also this relationship to the viewer, a one-to-one relationship, right? Having these figures, some of them looking back at you, being life-size. And then as you're walking through the space, you have to circumambulate the space. So circumambulation is sort of a prayer and meditation mode where you're walking and you're meditating. And that's sort of how you can experience the space, because in the middle there are these paintings that are somewhat cosmic. So I'm trying to bring these two sort of distant, but at the same time inseparable realities, which is you're in your own body, but at the same time you're also cosmic. And in between that, there's all this materiality. And in between that, there's all these beliefs and blueprints and architecture. So there's layers and layers and layers of the human experience. So that's sort of what I wanted to bring to the gallery as well. And I'm really interested in religion because it's a full experience. Religion is not a manifesto, it's not a thesis, it's a worldview. It's about being, it's about being human. So I wanted to sort of bring this idea that beliefs and worldviews are traveling through me and coursing through all of us, and it's coursing through the space. And, the painting of the space, that's sort of just one of the, I think, more effective ways to transform the space and sort of take us away from the immediate association of white walls and galleries and bring it back along with the works and how to move around the space back to our bodies. In my art practice, as I mentioned earlier, it's a process, and I'm bringing along, I'm carrying with me my own baggages, I'm carrying with me my own processes, and I'm carrying with me my own spirituality and belief systems. With that being said, I also expect the viewer to carry with them, when they walk into the exhibition space, everything that they carry with them. And to me, the art works, or the art experience, is where both of those things meet. And I want to create this space as a meditation space. There's a lot going on. I tend to create artworks that are very maximalist in the use of materials, which is I won't say contradictory, but it's perhaps unfamiliar with people who are familiar with a certain strand of maybe meditation practice or Buddhist teaching. So just for example, Buddhism was very influential during the modernist era. You had artists like John Cage and Duchamp and Robert Irwin using these ideas and creating very distilled work. They were very minimalist, and they were also the same ideas, the same meditative ideas of awareness. But it came from sort of the teachings of D.T. Suzuki from Japan, which were influenced by the Maji restoration in Japan, and then also industrialization in Japan, which became sort of this more distilled aesthetics when it came to awareness. Whereas when you look at Buddhist art in Thailand or in Cambodia, you see sort of this maximalist presentation, and they're not separate. They're So when I have this presentation, and I'm hoping people will sort of walk through it and spend some time here, you know, which why hopefully the audio would make people want to spend more time here. That sort of this materiality, this baggage sort of falls off, and sort of realize that all these forms, that although they take very concrete presentations and iconographies, very concrete ideologies, but you know, ultimately they're constructed, and they're constructed to tell a story. So I sort of want that as part of meditation as you're walking through, and you're circumambulating the room. You know, hence, you know, once again, sort of this dichotomy of the body, the space, and then sort of the center, which looks more like a galactic space. You know, there's like stars and shimmering and I guess spirals happening in there, and a very sort of a different use of materiality happening in the center as well. And definitely, you know, I'm definitely not trying to replicate the religious space, because there's already many religious spaces. But I must say, I don't see enough ideas of like spirituality and religion in art spaces. So I